My life 10 years ago felt like a runaway train. I was 22, freshly graduated from college, and suddenly devastatingly pregnant. The father was Thomas, the heir to a modest but extremely influential local manufacturing fortune. We'd had a passionate, brief affair, the kind you knew had an expiration date the moment it began. He was charming, attentive, and utterly out of my league in terms of family expectations. The moment I told him I was pregnant, everything changed. Thomas, to his credit, was shocked but immediately supportive. His mother, Eleanor, however, arrived like a Category 5 hurricane. Eleanor Reynolds was a woman who saw her family line as a carefully curated museum exhibit, and my unexpected pregnancy was a smudge on the glass she was determined to remove. The first few weeks were a relentless barrage of cold, calculating pressure. Eleanor didn't once ask about my health or the baby. Her only concern was the disruption to Thomas's meticulously planned future, which, according to her, involved a certain senator's daughter and a European honeymoon. "There are procedures for this, Miss Thompson," she'd said during our first tense meeting in her immaculate living room, the words termination hanging heavy in the air. I was young, but I was firm. "I'm keeping the baby, Eleanor. I won't ask for a dime, but I'm keeping my child." That's when Eleanor shifted tactics. She realized she couldn't eliminate the problem, so she decided to control it. She insisted on a paternity test, a standard demand, and one I readily agreed to. I was entirely confident. Thomas was the father. I had no other partners. The sample collection was a sterile, unsettling affair at a high-end private clinic Eleanor insisted upon. 2 weeks later, she summoned us back to her house. Thomas looked pale and resigned, but Eleanor looked victorious. "The results are conclusive," she announced, tapping a manicured nail on the manila folder. "Thomas is the father. 99.999% certainty." I felt a dizzying mix of relief and terror. Relief that Thomas would be confirmed, and terror that I was now inextricably linked to this terrifying woman. Eleanor wasted no time. "Since you two have created a biological link to the Reynolds name, you will formalize it immediately. No scandal, no illegitimate grandchild. You will marry Thomas within the month." Thomas didn't argue. He looked at me, not with love, but with a profound resignation that chilled me to the bone. It was less of a marriage proposal and more of a contractual obligation. Our wedding was a small, quiet affair orchestrated entirely by Eleanor. The dress, the venue, the guest list. I was a beautiful, compliant puppet in her narrative of crisis management. I remember walking down the aisle looking at Thomas and seeing a man who felt trapped, not triumphant. Over the next 10 years, that feeling of being trapped never left. We had a beautiful daughter, Clara, who was the light of my life and the sole reason I endured the toxic atmosphere of our marriage. Clara looked exactly like Thomas, the same deep-set eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw. She was living proof of the paternity test's result. But the marriage itself was a Cold War. Thomas was a decent provider and a loving father, but he was emotionally absent from me. We lived in the large, silent house Eleanor had insisted we buy, 2 streets away from her naturally. Thomas treated me with a distant respect, but the intimacy, the connection, the spark that had started it all was dead. I was the wife he was forced to have. This belief was reinforced every holiday, every family gathering by Eleanor. "You really should manage the housekeeping budget better, Sarah," she'd sigh. Thomas's first choice, Senator Harrison's daughter, would have handled this with more finesse. You are lucky, Sarah, that Thomas is a man of honor, she'd remarked during a toast. Most men of his stature would have simply signed the paperwork and moved on. He gave you a name. I always swallowed my pride for Clara's sake. I believed the coldness stemmed from Thomas's bitterness over the life he felt I had stolen, even though he was the father. The paternity test was the rock on which our marriage was built, but it was also the cage that kept Thomas away from me. I tried talking to Thomas about his unhappiness many times. Thomas, if you hate being married to me, we can find a way to co-parent peacefully, I'd pleaded. He would always reply with the same empty finality. Don't be dramatic, Sarah. We have Clara. We have our responsibilities. It is what it is. You are the mother of my child. That is the only thing that matters. The only thing that mattered. The paternity test result was the only pillar holding up our entire life. 10 years passed in this emotional limbo. Clara turned 10, a beautiful, vibrant girl. The constant tension between Thomas and me, fueled by Eleanor's constant reminders of my unworthiness, was beginning to affect her. I knew I couldn't live this half-life forever. Then, the final destructive layer of the lie began to peel away, initiated, ironically, by Eleanor herself. It started with a nervous call from her solicitor. A formal letter arrived, stating that due to a complexity in Thomas's grandfather's estate trust, a new, updated paternity test was required for Clara. The solicitor claimed it was a necessary legal formality to ensure the 10-year-old trust fund could be passed down to the grandchild. My stomach dropped. Why now? Why 10 years later, when the original test had been so clear? It was just a formality, I told myself, but a terrifying whisper started in the back of my mind. Why was Eleanor, the woman who had rushed us into marriage because of the first test, suddenly so insistent on a second one? And why did Thomas look more anxious and withdrawn than he had since our wedding day? The simple formality felt like the final shoe about to drop on the fragile, fake life we had built. I had no idea that the result of that first test was the biggest lie of all. The mandatory second paternity test, requested by Eleanor's solicitor, was conducted under an atmosphere far tenser than the rushed original 10 years prior. This time, the process was more transparent, and since it was mandated by an estate clause, the results were to be shared directly with Thomas's lawyer, and by extension, to us. Yet Eleanor's agitation and Thomas's almost catatonic nervousness suggested this was far more than a simple legal formality. On the day of the test, Thomas specifically asked me to take Clara and wait outside. I'll handle it, Sarah. I need to speak to Eleanor's solicitor about a few details. His secrecy fueled the suspicions I had suppressed for 10 years. Why was Thomas so anxious about a formality? He had looked just as defeated when the first results came in. Back then, I assumed it was the disappointment of having to marry me. Now, it felt like he was terrified of a secret being resurfaced. I took Clara to a nearby cafe. As she sipped her hot chocolate, I replayed the last decade. There was always a distance in my relationship with Thomas. He treated me like a necessary fixture, an obligation. I recalled a night 5 years into our marriage when a drunken Thomas hugged me and mumbled, "I'm so sorry I had to do this to you, Sarah. You're a good person." At the time, I thought he meant he was sorry he resented me. But now, a different scenario began to bloom in my mind. Was his sorrow due to a lie that had forced us into this marriage? Sitting there, the lawyer in me began to stir. If Eleanor had manipulated the first test 10 years ago, why? The obvious answer was to force Thomas to marry me, but why did Thomas resist so fiercely? Just over a pregnancy? Or was Clara not Thomas's child at all? The idea was simultaneously preposterous and terrifyingly explanatory. Clara was Thomas's spitting image. Everyone swore she was. But as a lawyer who had seen thousands of DNA cases, I knew appearances could be deceiving. I acted quickly. I remembered the exclusive clinic Eleanor had insisted upon for the first test, Elite Diagnostics. It was the kind of high-profile place where, despite the veneer of professionalism, backdoor dealings could easily happen. I carefully collected a swab of saliva from Clara on a napkin and discreetly tucked it into my purse. It was the kind of unofficial insurance sample any lawyer would want in a risky situation. Instead of going back to Elite Diagnostics, I drove Clara to an independent lab in another city, one Eleanor would never know about. I didn't have a copy of Thomas's original sample, but a third-party genetic material was often required for a husband and wife to compare their own child's DNA. At the lab, I submitted a few strands of hair I had secretly collected from Thomas's brush and Clara's swab. Thomas's hair, I realized, could hold the key to a decade-long nightmare. 2 weeks later, the anticipated results arrived. First, the official email from Thomas's lawyer, the second paternity test results. My hands shook as I opened the attachment. Probability of paternity between Thomas Reynolds and Clara Reynolds, 99.999%. I should have felt relief. Here, for the second time, science confirmed Thomas as the father. But something felt profoundly wrong. Eleanor's anxiety, Thomas's defeat, the 10 years of frigidity in our marriage. Was it all just because Thomas was forced to marry? This did not feel like a simple, coerced marriage. It felt like a complicated, calculated, and nefarious plan only Eleanor could devise. That evening, when Thomas came home, I cornered him in the kitchen. "Thomas, be honest. Why did this second test stress you out so much? You are Clara's father. It's confirmed. What are you hiding?" He replied, as if surrounded by an invisible wall. "I'm hiding nothing, Sarah. I'm just exhausted by Eleanor's constant manipulation. Just let it go." The next day, I opened the envelope from the independent lab. This was a comparison done purely on Thomas and Clara's genetic materials, without any legal papers or lawyer letters, just raw science. I opened the sheet and was confronted by the exact opposite of the official report. Probability that Thomas Reynolds is the biological father of Clara Reynolds, 0.01%. It was a shockwave that burned through every neuron in my brain. My eyes scanned it again and again. 0%. Thomas was not Clara's father. This meant the official document sent by Thomas's lawyer was an absolute forgery. And if this was a forgery, then the first test that rushed us into marriage was also a lie. Thomas hadn't been forced to marry me. Eleanor had forced him with a rigged test. But if Thomas wasn't Clara's father, who was? The question of the biological father suddenly became secondary. The priority was this. Did Thomas know the truth of this 10-year lie? Was he the only one who knew that he hadn't fathered the child while I lived for a decade, believing he resented me for trapping him? The fury I felt toward Eleanor was replaced by a deep sense of betrayal toward Thomas. Thomas could have saved me from the clutches of that cruel woman, but he hadn't. Why? With the real and the fake reports in my hands, I decided to drive straight to Thomas's office. But before I got there, I needed to know one thing. Did Thomas know this lie for 10 years? If so, why did he marry me, and why did he maintain the charade of fatherhood for a decade? Eleanor's power had always been built on Thomas's weakness, and now I sensed a much darker secret lurking beneath that weakness. I drove to Thomas's office, the real DNA report clutched in my hand, my mind a whirlwind of fury and disbelief. He worked on the top floor of the Reynolds building, a physical manifestation of the gilded cage Eleanor had built. I bypassed his startled secretary and burst into his huge, silent office. Thomas was on a call, but the moment he saw my face, my pale, shaking hands holding the lab envelope, his professional composure evaporated. He slammed the phone down. "Sarah, what is wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I threw the envelope onto his mahogany desk. The single sheet of paper landed between his fountain pen and a pristine picture of Clara. "I haven't seen a ghost, Thomas. I found a fraud. A 10-year-old life-destroying fraud. You are not Clara's father." Thomas didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch with surprise. He just slumped back in his leather chair, defeat washing over his face. The resignation I had seen on our wedding day and on the day of the second test finally made horrific sense. "You know," he whispered, rubbing his temples, "you finally know." "You knew this entire time?" I asked, my voice barely a tremor. "You knew that the first paternity test was rigged? You let me believe I trapped you. You let your mother torture me for a decade, reminding me of the life I stole, when you could have ended it all by telling the truth." He looked up, and his eyes were full of a painful sincerity that was almost worse than denial. "I didn't know immediately, Sarah." I didn't know for sure until about a week after the wedding. He explained the night of the first test result. Eleanor had called him into her study and presented the paperwork with the 99.999% certainty. Thomas had been resigned, ready to do his duty. But a few days later, he found a discarded note on Eleanor's desk, a hastily scribbled list of names and account numbers. One name belonged to the lab technician at Elite Diagnostics. I confronted her, Thomas admitted, his voice hollow. I told her I knew she had swapped the samples or bribed the technician. She didn't deny it. She just looked at me with that cold smile and said, "Of course I did, Thomas. Do you really think I'd let a pregnant nobody ruin your future? Then why, Thomas? Why didn't you leave me? Why not tell me, divorce me, and expose her?" He stood up, walking to the panoramic window that overlooked the city, the empire Eleanor controlled. "It wasn't about the money, Sarah." "Not just the money. When I found out the test was rigged, I was furious. I told Eleanor I was going to expose her, that I would leave you and tell everyone the truth. And that's when she dropped the real bomb." He turned back to me. The color drained from his face. "Eleanor didn't just rig the test to force the marriage. She rigged it to protect the family name from the real father." "What are you talking about? Who is the real father?" I demanded, the secondary question suddenly becoming the primary terror. "The real father," Thomas said slowly, "is my brother, Julian." The sound of my own gasp was deafening in the vast office. Julian, Thomas's older brother, the golden boy, the brilliant architect who lived abroad and visited once a year for Christmas. The man Eleanor adored, the one she constantly held up as the paragon of Reynolds' perfection. It was a one-night thing, Sarah. Thomas continued, unable to meet my eyes. He was home for a week during his college break. You had just broken up with your ex. You two were drunk at a party. You told me it was just a fling, and he left immediately after. But when Eleanor realized you were pregnant, she panicked. She wasn't worried about me having an illegitimate child. She was terrified of Julian having one. He explained Eleanor's cruel logic. Julian was the designated heir to the main family fortune, the pure bloodline. Any stain on his character, especially a baby born out of wedlock to a woman who wasn't his approved match, would be catastrophic. Thomas, the younger, less vital son, was expendable. She forced Julian to leave the country immediately after he found out you were pregnant, promising him if he went, she'd take care of the problem. Taking care of the problem meant coercing her weak, loyal son, me, to marry you and claim the child as my own. Thomas finished, his voice cracking. I agreed to the lie, Sarah, because Eleanor threatened to cut Julian off entirely. She threatened to tell the patriarchs of the family trust that Julian had a mental instability that made him unfit to inherit. My mind reeled. The shame, the betrayal, the intricate cruelty of it all. Eleanor had orchestrated a perfect cover-up, sacrificing one son's happiness and one woman's dignity to protect the true heir. So you sacrificed our lives for your brother's inheritance? I asked, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. I sacrificed it for Julian's future, yes. I was the lesser son, Sarah. She made sure I knew it every single day. She gave me two choices: expose her, ruin Julian, and destroy my own access to the family's minor holdings, or marry you, give Clara the Reynolds name, and keep the peace. I chose the path of least family destruction. You chose yourself, Thomas. I corrected him coldly, and you chose to condemn me to 10 years of believing I was the villain, the one who ruined your life, when in fact, you were just a scared accomplice to your mother's crime. I picked up the picture of Clara, her bright, innocent smile mocking the despair in the room. She was Julian's daughter, my daughter, raised by Thomas, the surrogate father. The discovery of Julian's involvement opened up a whole new realm of chaos. Julian, the perfect distant uncle, was my daughter's biological father, and he had no idea because Eleanor had ensured his silence and ignorance. Now I had a decade of lies to unravel, not just with Thomas, but with the man who truly shared my daughter's DNA. Leaving Thomas's office, I felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with sheer, paralyzing terror. The gilded cage was cracked open, but the exposure to the truth was blinding. I was officially divorcing my husband, discovering my child's father was her uncle, and preparing to demolish the life of the most powerful woman I knew, Eleanor Reynolds. My first stop was Eleanor's home. I didn't call. I didn't announce myself. I simply walked into her opulent living room where she was enjoying her afternoon tea, looking every inch the undisturbed matriarch. I didn't waste time. I placed the real DNA report on her antique coffee table. The trust is secure, Eleanor. But the lie is over. Thomas told me everything. I know about Julian. Eleanor didn't gasp or faint. She set her teacup down with a measured clink. Her eyes, usually cold, were now alight with a chilling kind of admiration. Thomas is weak. I always knew he would fold under pressure. But you, Sarah, you have tenacity. You're the child I should have raised. You sacrificed your son's happiness and my life to protect Julian's inheritance, I stated, my voice dangerously level. You forced your lesser son to raise your favorite son's child, all to maintain your perfect pedigree. She didn't deny it. It was a necessity. Thomas would have been a poor father in a scandalous situation. Julian, with his future, needed protection. I gave Clara the only stable outcome possible, the Reynolds name and fortune. You should be thanking me. Thank you for 10 years of being a trophy wife to a man who didn't love me, all while knowing my daughter's biological father was eating dinner with us every Christmas. Thank you for stealing my agency and turning my life into a lie? You had an accident, Sarah, Eleanor snapped, her voice rising slightly. I provided the cleanup. You got wealth, status, and a beautiful daughter who will never know shame. The only mistake I made was not getting a prenup that explicitly detailed the paternity clause. I realized then that Eleanor was incapable of remorse. Her moral compass pointed only towards advantage. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow, I announced, and I'm seeking primary custody of Clara. I will not mention Julian's name to the courts, but if you or Thomas attempt to fight me, I will expose the rigged paternity tests, the cover-up, and Julian's biological relationship with Clara. Your perfect pedigree will be tabloid fodder, and Julian's trust will be invalidated by fraud. Eleanor paled for the first time. The threat to Julian's inheritance was the only thing that could ever truly break her. You win, Sarah, she conceded through gritted teeth. But you will never see a dime of my personal money, and you will teach Clara to respect the Reynolds name. I will teach Clara the truth of her strength, something you know nothing about, I retorted, and walked out, leaving the untouchable matriarch utterly defeated. The next challenge was Julian. I found his number through Thomas's contacts and called him in Geneva. Julian, I began, trying to sound calm, this is Sarah. We need to talk about Clara. He was immediately guarded. Clara? She's fine, isn't she? What's wrong? I took a deep breath. Julian, 10 years ago, after our night together, I got pregnant. Eleanor found out. She rigged the paternity test, forced Thomas to marry me, and told you nothing. Clara is your daughter. Silence. A crushing transatlantic silence. That's a sick joke, Sarah, he finally said, his voice flat with denial. I was told Thomas was the father. Eleanor said she handled it. She handled it by selling me and Thomas a lie to protect your reputation. I have the DNA proof. I have Thomas's confession. Clara is your biological child. His reaction wasn't curiosity or fatherly instinct. It was pure, self-centered panic. Does Thomas know? Does the family know? You cannot tell anyone my career, my firm. It would be destroyed. You have to keep this quiet. The sheer audacity of his response cemented the truth. Julian was Eleanor's perfect son, cold, privileged, and deeply selfish. He had been complicit in the silence, even if he hadn't known the specifics. He valued his status over his 10-year-old daughter. Your mother protected you, Julian. Thomas protected you. Now it's your turn to choose. Are you going to be a silent uncle or are you going to be a father? I asked. He chose silence. I can't. Not now. Not ever. I'm sorry, Sarah. Please, just raise her the way you have been. His rejection hurt, but it also freed me. I was no longer navigating a messy family triangle. I was simply protecting my daughter from two men too weak to stand up to their mother's legacy. The final terrifying hurdle remained. Clara. How do I tell my 10-year-old that her life, her name, and her entire family structure is built on a decade of calculated lies? I sat Clara down in the living room, the space where I had endured so much of Eleanor's condescension. I didn't tell her about Julian or the rigged tests right away. I started simple, focusing on love. "Clara, Mommy and Daddy are getting a divorce," I began, explaining that Thomas would always be in her life, but we would live in a new, smaller home, free of her grandmother's constant judgment. Then came the hardest part. "There is something very important I need to tell you. Thomas is not your biological father, darling, but he loves you very much and he always will." Clara, so smart and intuitive, looked at me, her eyes wide with shock and the beginning of tears. "But who is? Who is my real daddy?" The answer was complicated, but I knew I had to tell her the truth, stripped of Eleanor's manipulation and Thomas's cowardice. I had to tell her she was not a scandal or a problem to be cleaned up. She was the beautiful, accidental result of a simple mistake, now protected by the fierce love of her mother. Clara's initial reaction to the truth that Thomas was not her biological father was heartbreaking, but not explosive. She was confused, retreating into a quiet sadness that worried me deeply. "But if Thomas isn't my real dad, then why did he marry you?" "Was I a mistake?" she asked, her 10-year-old eyes reflecting an adult level of pain. I held her tight. "You were never a mistake, Clara. You were a precious, wanted surprise. Thomas married me because he loved you and wanted to give you a strong name and a good life. That love, the way he tucks you in and teaches you chess, that is real love. That is true fatherhood. I chose to omit Julian's identity entirely. There was no point in introducing her to a biological father who explicitly rejected her existence to protect his bank account. Clara had enough to process. For now, the story was simple. Thomas was her father in every way that mattered, and her biological father was a non-entity who didn't know her. The divorce from Thomas was swift and clean. Eleanor, true to her word, did not fight the custody claim, terrified that I would expose Julian. Thomas, guilt-ridden and weak, ceded everything I asked for. A substantial settlement, secured under the threat of exposing the forged trust documents, and a formal agreement that he would maintain his role as Clara's father, without demanding any DNA tests or making any mention of the biological truth to her unless I initiated it. We moved into a charming, smaller house about 20 minutes from Thomas, and importantly, 40 minutes from Eleanor. For the first time in a decade, I felt like the air around me was clean and the silence was peaceful, not stifling. Thomas visited Clara every week, and true to the terms of our agreement, he never wavered in his role as a loving, engaged father. The bizarre truth of our new life was that our relationship, now defined by honesty and co-parenting rather than forced spousal obligation, was far healthier than our 10-year marriage had ever been. He was finally free of Eleanor's immediate pressure, and I was free of his resentment. Eleanor, however, suffered the most profound consequence. She had defeated me financially, but had lost her ultimate weapon, control. She continued to treat me with icy civility, but her power over the family waned. The truth about the rigged test, though never legally proven, was whispered among the peripheral family members, enough to chip away at her flawless matriarchal image. Her beloved Julian, who never acknowledged Clara, became even more distant, living his perfect, lonely life abroad, a testament to her cold-blooded prioritization of wealth over family. My own life was an act of reclamation. I left corporate law. The idea of prioritizing money and structure over truth and ethics was too repellent after living Eleanor's lie. I started my own small firm, specializing in family law and mediation, helping other women navigate complex custody battles and hidden family traumas. My experience with the Reynolds' elaborate deception gave me a unique perspective. The most important thing in any family dispute is the truth, no matter how messy. As Clara grew older, the truth of her parentage became a backdrop, not the main plot. She continued to call Thomas Dad. She excelled in school and inherited the best of both my biological side, a fierce loyalty and quick wit, and Thomas's side, a quiet, gentle confidence. A year after the divorce, Thomas visited me unexpectedly. He looked worn but genuinely peaceful. He had something for me, a small sealed envelope. "What is this, Thomas?" "It's a letter from Julian," he said, his voice low. "He sent it a few months ago. He said he finally needed to tell you something." I held on to it because I wasn't sure if it was another lie. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single-typed page from Julian. It wasn't an apology for his silence. It was a cold, final confession. He admitted that Eleanor had manipulated the test, and he had been paid handsomely to stay silent. But the last line was the most telling. "I often think about her, Sarah, and I realize every perfect thing I have, my career, my wealth, my distance, it all rests on the quiet courage of a child who doesn't even know my name. Please tell her that the only thing worth more than the Reynolds inheritance is the truth you chose to give her." It was a pathetic, self-serving end to the saga of Julian, but it confirmed one final piece of the puzzle. Even the golden boy was deeply damaged by Eleanor's cruelty. I burned the letter. Clara didn't need that kind of burden. I realized my true birthright wasn't a surname or an inheritance. It was my strength. Eleanor had intended to use the lie to bind me to her family's prestige forever. Instead, her 10-year-long act of manipulation gave me the exact strength and legal knowledge needed to dismantle this control and build a truly honest life. I was Sarah Thompson, no longer the reluctant Mrs. Reynolds. I was the mother who chose truth over tradition. And that, I knew, was a legacy worth far more than any manipulated fortune. Thank you for listening to this difficult confession. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments section below.